fact, fiction, and fantasy. May we kindly request all guests to turn their phones to silent. However, please feel free to tweet comments to #Brunel Lectures. Should the fire alarm sound, please make your way calmly out of the auditorium to your closest exit and follow directions from stewards to the designated meeting point. Now, please give a warm welcome to the stage, Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Academic Affairs and Civic Engagement, Professor William Leahy.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along on this beautiful evening. We were expecting more, but it's great that so many have come. It looks like about 100, so that's fantastic. Thank you so much. So this is the final evening in our public lecture series. I can see some familiar faces. Some of you have been here, I think, for all of them up to now, so thank you so much. If this is the first one that you're coming to, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy it. I think it's a very interesting theme that we have this evening, this Designing for Happiness. We have 3 fantastic speakers, some of the brightest minds at Brunel, so we're all really looking forward to it. Do feel free to tweet, #Brunel Lectures. The more you tweet, the more interest it generates. There will be lots of people looking online as well. So far, we've had about 500 people here in person in the lectures and about 2,500 watching online. So we'll probably get over 3,000 this evening. So that's been great for us. Now, a couple of things I wanted to say before we begin. The first is, it'd be very interesting to hear how you heard about the public lecture series. If we've tweeted you or if you just go on the Brunel website, that's great. However, we do have a What's On guide. Now, to receive the What's On guide, you need to register, and there are leaflets like this outside where it tells you how to register. And there, if you do register, we will proactively contact you with all of the various events that are happening, so that you can stick it in your diary and you know exactly what your social life looks like, okay? So do pick up one of those. There is another great way of finding out what's going on at Brunel in each week, and that's if you, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. every Sunday evening, there is a radio show now on Hayes FM, 91.8 Hayes FM. Okay, there is a punchline. Just wait for the punchline. That's you can stream it online, or you can download the app from the App Store. Hayes FM 91.8, 6 p.m. every Sunday with DJ Bill Leahy. Yeah, it's me. Thank you. Thanks, Mum. Now it's not just me talking, in case you're worried, but I do talk about events that are coming up at Brunel. I also talk about my favourite type of music, and it's the music that I play for the show, and that's reggae music. So I think we've got a very enthusiastic reggae audience in tonight. I can see that you're all up for that. So do listen to that every Sunday, and you can hear what's going on at Brunel. Anyway, without further ado, please do enjoy the evening, and it's going to be a really interesting one. I've just got a feeling. I know the 3 speakers. Oh, it's going to be interesting. And do note the shoes as they come up. Some interesting shoes tonight. Not least on our moderator for the evening. So do please give a round of applause for our Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation, Professor Geoff Rodgers.
So thank you very much, Bill. I think it's been a super public lecture series so far, and so I'm delighted to be moderating the final lecture on Designing for Happiness, Space, Solitude and the Senses. And I think we're almost certainly going to end the series on a real high. And we're going to be looking at how bold new approaches might hold the answer to the future of urban living, our interactions and isolations, and our ageing population. And I think it's a really interesting topic, and actually something that we have a lot of researchers here at Brunel thinking about these types of questions with a variety of methodologies, whether it's in engineering, social science, arts, design, or indeed in health sciences. And so we've got three brilliant speakers who represent a number of those disciplines: Professor Christina Victor, Dr. Monica Deegan, and Dr. Gabriela Spinelli. And I'm going to introduce them in turn in a few minutes. And then there'll be some time for some questions, and then we can go outside and have a glass of wine and just continue the discussions before making our way out into the snow. So when we get to the questions, we try and keep the questions brief, and it'll give us a chance to have get a few more questions and answers in, and that will make for a more productive discussion. Right, so I think I'll start off by introducing our first speaker, who is Professor Christina Victor, who is Professor of Gerontology and Public Health, and also Vice Dean for Research in the College of Health and Life Sciences, and she's also the Research Theme Leader for Ageing in the Institute of Environment, Health and Societies. Christina, who I've actually known since she first started working at Brunel. In fact, the first day I met her, she was wearing a pair of rather scruffy trainers. So things have moved on a little bit since then. But anyway, is going to be talking about the myths and the realities of loneliness in modern society and across the life course, and in the context of a very highly connected society. And this is an area that she's done a lot of research in, that we have a big group in, and it's an area which she can speak with a great deal of authority. So, Christina.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks so much for coming along on what is a not especially prepossessing evening. Although my topic is loneliness in later life and across the life course, I hope that at the end of the evening I will have made you happy, or at least contribute to enhancing your happiness by reassuring you that perhaps some of the more popular and alarmist statements that are made about the consequences of loneliness perhaps are fit nearer the fantasy than the fact part of our series title, and that perhaps it'll give you some food for thought to think differently about loneliness and its place in contemporary society. So my starting point for the lecture this evening is that loneliness is not inevitably pathological. The current trend is to pathologise loneliness and attribute it the status of a disease rather than as a state of mind, rather than something that is perhaps intrinsically part of being human and is something that is almost certainly a fairly universal experience. And so I want to hope that, and encourage you to think differently about loneliness. So I want to start to ask you to just take a moment to think of a time when you felt lonely. So it's okay, I'm not going to ask you to tell me about it. You don't have to fill out a questionnaire, or the opportunities for that are at the end of the lecture. But I just want you to reflect for a moment on a time when you experienced loneliness, and to think about what the experience was like. Was it a fleeting emotion, one that passed in a few seconds, or was it something that was longer lasting, more enduring, that stayed with you for a period of time? Were there particular triggers? Was it the sound of some music, perhaps, on the radio? Young people, you can look up what they are on Wikipedia. Was it perhaps a specific smell? Or was it a particular place when you experienced the feeling? Was it linked to a particular time of year and date? So I think while you're thinking about that, I shall show you the situation in which I feel lonely. So when I was younger, I was a serious swimmer. Now I just swim. There's nothing serious about it. But for me, the time when I experience loneliness is the moment when I'm on the starting block for a race. For those of you who don't know about swimming, there's somebody is in charge, they blow 4 whistles, and they gesture to you to get up on the starting block. And at that moment, that is, for me, the epitome of loneliness, because it's not that I think that anybody's looking at me, but it's that is the moment at which I have to deliver all of the training that my coach and my teammates have given me. And I think, so in reflecting on my experience and on your experience, I think we can see that loneliness is not a homogeneous, static type of experience, which perhaps some of the representations that we see of loneliness in the press and other media might suggest, that it's actually quite a complicated emotion, and we need to reflect that in perhaps how we research and understand and think about it. So, as with all things, I'm going to do what the traditional academic does, which is make an apparently simple thing incredibly complicated. That's what they pay us for, so that I can buy the shoes. So for me, my loneliness has a particular temporal and spatial context. It's linked to a time and a place. And when we think about trying to understand loneliness, we very rarely take that spatial and temporal context into account. And also, there's some research that with some colleagues who are in the room and that links to Monica's work, we're starting to think about loneliness as a sensory experience. So what does loneliness feel like? What does it sound like? What does it taste like? What does it look like? None of these factors or the contexts in which we experience loneliness seem to be recognised in current debates about the nature and consequences of being lonely. And as a good academic, I can make it yet more complicated for you. If we think about the experience of loneliness, I think that we are not really covering the concept in its full depth, because for me, loneliness has a number of very important dimensions. So the frequency, so how often does it happen? The intensity, how strong is the feeling? And the duration, how long does it last? So with those three factors, at one end of the distribution, you have somebody who experiences loneliness very often, of very high intensity, that is long-lasting. And at the other end of the continuum, you have people who may experience it infrequently for a very short period of time and not intensely. And our current work about understanding loneliness does not really reflect that complexity. So, I gave you all the task of thinking about loneliness. I'm sure most of you managed to achieve that. But one of the really important issues when we're trying to measure it, understand it, and interpret the current kind of debates is the use of language and kind of terminological inexactitude. So, we have three terms that you often see in the literature that are used interchangeably. They're related, but they are conceptually different. So, I'm just trying to work out. On my right, we have a sheep, a lone sheep. That was the best I could do as an illustration of somebody living alone or being alone. So we often see people who live alone almost as the assumption is almost made that they are lonely. Whereas in fact, living alone is just a description of exactly that. It tells you what your household size is, nothing more, nothing less. The middle picture is a group of people. And this could be the individual who's standing at the back with his arms behind his back. Let's hypothesize that's his social network. Those are all the people he knows. When we are looking at social networks, we tend to count the number of people in them, and the people with a very small network we consider or characterize as being isolated. So again, isolation is often used interchangeably with loneliness. It's not the same thing at all. Isolation describes the size of your social network, but doesn't tell you anything about the quality of your social relationships. Loneliness, which is in some ways exemplified by the cartoon at the far end, where we have an interviewer and an interviewee engaged in an interview, but there's no social interaction between them. Loneliness is the expression of the differential between our expectations of social relationships in terms of either the quantity, the quality, or perhaps even the way we get them and what we have. It's that gap between those various phenomena. So you can see in the cartoon, perhaps the person who's being interviewed would like to be socially, having a social relationship with the interviewer, where the interviewer is just busy looking at their form. So I got into being interested in loneliness by reading Peter Townsend's book called The Family Life of Old People, published in 1954. I ask all my students to read it, and as you see, I like to have a contemporary and current up-to-date reading list. So, loneliness has been seen in the post-war period as a problem of old age. It's been characterised almost as a part of normal ageing. And what I want to show you this evening are some illustrations of how our understanding of loneliness has moved from being a social problem of old age to a public health problem, perhaps to now a moral panic. So in the immediate post-war period, there were various surveys done, and the kinds of pictures you see there from Age UK are very typical of how, perhaps up to about 10 years ago, we thought of loneliness as being equated with old age, and not much more than that. And in terms of how we thought about loneliness and older people, there are a number of established stereotypes, which I now have the privilege of boring you with my kind of views on those. And perhaps one of the most prevalent of all representations of loneliness and older people is exemplified by the preoccupation with loneliness at Christmas. I wrote an article in The Conversation, plug, if you want to have a look at it, we can send you the link. You get all the age-related charities sending appeals for money with varying degrees of tastefulness in their slogan. So Age UK, no one should have no one at Christmas, and it goes on from there. And this is with colleagues who are also interested in loneliness in later life. We run a little sweepstake as to who's going to be the first person to identify the first advertisement for money in support of preventing loneliness for old people at Christmas. So I won this year, and it was the 29th of September. So I won last year, so I'm hoping I'll keep my winning form. But this is I'm very interested in how this association was made, because there's actually very little robust empirical evidence to justify it. And with some colleagues from Brunel and with some funding from the university, we did a very small study which looked at a group of people, and we followed them up over the year and asked them what to report their loneliness at different times of year. And actually, loneliness did not peak at Christmas. It peaked in the summer, which was counterintuitive to everybody. I wanted to entitle the paper we wrote, "No One Invites Granny to the Barbecue," but my co-authors didn't seem to think that was a weighty enough title for such a profound work. So I have no idea where this association was first reported. If anybody knows, I'd be really interested. But it is a complete misrepresentation of the experience of loneliness for older people over the course of a year. So one of the interesting features of the debate about loneliness has various politicians have got involved, various varieties, of which Jeremy Hunt is one of them. So from 2013, 2015, he's made a number of statements about loneliness and older people. And there are two features of his comments that I would just like to draw your attention to. If we look at the text at the bottom of the slide, which I hope you can read, he states, "It's a source of national shame that as many as 800,000 people in England are chronically lonely." So this is a really good example of much of the debate about loneliness, but other things as well, of numerator epidemiology. So you tell me the number of people who've got loneliness, but you don't tell me the entire population who are at risk of it. So 800,000 is a big number. Is it 800,000 out of 1 million? In which case that's 80%, that's a big problem. Is it 800,000 out of 60 million? In which case it's less of a problem. And lots of the things that we see written about loneliness only give us one part of the data. And Jeremy Hunt I don't have time to go into all of his sayings. I'm sure we can arrange a special session for anybody who'd like to join in on that one. But he also introduces new stereotypes in there. As you can see, if you can see the text, it says, "I'm struck by the reverence and impact for older people in Asian culture." And again, he is representing an entire culture in a particular way, and stereotypes work both ways. So Hunt, is very critical of how the British population neglects their older people, which is a different lecture and entirely untrue, and valorises the caring nature of Asian cultures, which the handy headline I find there suggests is perhaps not as true as he thinks it is. So there are lots of myths and stereotypes that are abound in this area. And I move along now to think about loneliness has now been reframed from a problem of old age to a public health issue, and particularly as an epidemic. So it's very common to see now headlines, the loneliness epidemic, etc., etc. So the term epidemic is being used here in a slightly loose way. The classic definition of an epidemic is as the rapid spread of infectious diseases to a large number of people in a particular geographical area over a short period of time. And is typically characterised by infectious diseases. So the classic example for me is that of cholera. So Jon Snow, not the broadcaster, there is another Jon Snow who I think is slightly more important than the other one. Jon Snow was a medical doctor who was the first person to identify cholera was a waterborne disease and to stop it. So that's a kind of image that's being used, the metaphor that's being used to characterise loneliness. And on Monday we also had details of the epidemic of diabetes. So is there a loneliness epidemic amongst older people? How would we know? Well, one thing would be is if there's a great increase in prevalence. So the prevalence of diabetes has increased significantly over the last 20 or 30 years. What's happened to loneliness? So on the left, oh no, I can't do my left and my right, my apologies. On the right-hand side is a frontispiece of a book called The Social Medicine of Old Age, published in 1948, which I also suggest my students read. Cutting-edge research is at the heart of all of my lectures. And this was the first survey that was undertaken of the conditions of older people in post-war Britain by a guy called Sheldon, who was a geriatrician. And in his survey, he included the first question on loneliness that I can find. If anybody knows of anything earlier, I'd be really pleased to hear it. I'm very sorry that he is now dead, and I can't ask him what motivated him to ask that question. And his study showed that 8% of the people he interviewed, over 65, in, as it happens, Wolverhampton, were often or always lonely. And I repeated that study, but at a national level with some of my colleagues in 2003. And I guess most of you would assume if it was 8% in 1948, be about 28%. Actually, the proportion of older people who reported that they were often or always lonely was 9%. So absolutely no change in the prevalence of loneliness over about 60 years. So actually the idea, so of course there are more lonely older people, because in absolute terms the number of older people has increased. But in relative terms, it most certainly is not an epidemic in the way that some other diseases may be. So as Geoff has said, my title is Professor of Gerontology, so I guess I shouldn't complain about the interest in loneliness and older people. But in the interests of intergenerational equity, it's important to point out that actually there are two groups who show the highest levels of loneliness in contemporary Britain, and that is older people, where let's say for the sake of argument it's 9 or 10%, and the other group is young adults. So both of the populations represented in that slide. So roughly, youngsters aged 16 to 24 and older people aged over 65 have the highest levels of loneliness at about 10%. With the other age groups, it's about 5%. But that is a cross-sectional statement. We've gone out now and asked, so if we surveyed everybody in the room, that's a cross-sectional study. That tells us loneliness now, or I might have asked you to think about loneliness in the last year. But the problem with that is that says now, it doesn't tell you about previous points in your history. So longitudinal studies are much better for looking at people who may be enduringly lonely over time, so we can see people for whom it is a new experience or an enduring experience. And so in order to make something much more complicated than it already is, if we look at it longitudinally, we can identify 5 groups. People who are never lonely, people who are always lonely, people who are moving into loneliness, and people who are moving out of loneliness. And then if you do the follow-up more than twice, there's an irritating group of people who can't make up their minds which category they want to fall into. So our prevalence of 10% of people who are lonely is made up of all those different groups. And so if we're thinking about trying to think about the consequences of loneliness, then mixing them all up together, I think, is not helping us. So I'm going to move swiftly on to just get you to think a little bit about two particular issues, one of which is the health consequences of loneliness. So there are lots of data. So if I can do the techie bit. Oh, okay. So, it arrived. Yeah, the wonders of modern science. We should take these with a pinch of salt. Many of these relationships are associations. So 2 things are correlated. It is another matter to say that there's a causal relationship. So if somebody's lonely and has dementia, then there's a second complication. Are they lonely because they've got dementia, or is the dementia causing their loneliness? So we have 2 routes. And the stalk is there just to remind us of you can associate 2 things that are that seem to be statistically significant, but actually aren't. So this is one of the nice papers that demonstrate an association between the number of storks in a city zoo and the birth rate. We probably wouldn't think that was causal. So when we're thinking about loneliness and health outcomes, we need to be a bit cuter. And my last sort of significant slide is what I think is now a slightly more alarming debate about loneliness and older people, where we've almost generated a moral panic about the NHS essentially going to fall apart, not because it's underfunded or the migrant workers have gone back home or because we haven't got an appropriate workforce. It's lonely old people going to hospital or their GPs that are going to end civilization as we know it. And my headline at the bottom is there from the Daily Express, and it says, lonely elderly make 30 million GP visits for the company. And again, I want to try and get you to think about putting that into context. So 30 million is a big number, but there are actually 350 million GP consultations in England per year, of which about 30% roughly are accounted for by older people. So roughly, if we divide 30 into 120, it's about a handy percent, okay? So it's not 100%. It's not that large. And then we need to think, how did we arrive at that? We've already decided that loneliness is my subjective feeling, my gap between. And actually, these data were generated by a survey of GPs, phoning up the GPs and saying, on an average day, how many of the people who come into your surgery are lonely? So it's not even, are people consulting because they're lonely? It's how many do you think might be lonely? Which it seems to me a kind of creative way of generating data. So I want to reassure you that you won't, if you are lonely, you're probably not going to break the NHS. So carry on. And so the last thing I want to say is that loneliness, like everything else, there are all sorts of interests here, and people want to do something. We must do something about loneliness in society. So let's kind of think about, well, is that really necessary? Perhaps there's only some groups we might want to do something for. And you can see there are a variety of different approaches, which I'm not going to go into. We have a minister for loneliness at the macro level and lots of individual interventions, many of which involve chickens for some reason that I don't entirely understand. But what we're missing out on, I think, when we're looking at interventions are the kinds of things that my two colleagues are going to talk about how the environment, how design, how we think about our cities can also perhaps more constructively enhance social connections and perhaps make our society less lonely if that's what we want. And now this is my shameless bit of self-promotion. You're here because you're interested in loneliness, with some colleagues at the University of Manchester and Exeter, and in collaboration with Radio 4, so that's Claudia Hammond, the most presentable member of the team. We're running what we're shamelessly calling the world's largest survey on loneliness, but it's not just for lonely people, it's also about positive aspects of loneliness. I believe that Sebastian has set up a link so that by the time you get home, there will be a link to the survey which you can complete and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. That's got us off to a great start. I see you couldn't quite see Claudia's shoes in that photograph, but anyway. So our next speaker is Dr. Monica Deegan, who is a reader in Sociology and Communications in the Department of Social and Political Science. She's a cultural sociologist with research focused on urban life and culture, and with a particular interest in the ways in which sensory experiences mediate our relationships in and with urban environments. She's done a lot of work in Europe, looking at different city designs and people's different experiences of different cities in which they have lived. Monica will discuss how cities increasingly manufacture urban experiences to compete for investment, and how we can reclaim the city through our own sensory engagements with it. Monica.
Hi, good evening. First of all, I wanted to welcome everybody and say thank you for actually being here despite the snow. And also for those that are tuning in from abroad, I know there's quite a few people live looking at our live stream. And I also wanted to say that I'm standing here despite the strike. I am supporting the strike in higher education, but I also think as academics we have a role as public academics, and it's important to be here for me tonight. So I want to basically reflect tonight on the state of contemporary urban life. And I want to do this by focusing on how we feel in cities, by paying attention to our sensory experiences and think about how they can enrich our life and also encourage more sociable cities. So let me see if I can work the technology. Yes. For a long time, the city has had a really bad press, as it's classically portrayed as the epitome for loneliness. This recent bestseller by Olivia Laing, for example, The Lonely City, really encapsulates what it means to be living, or the myth of living in a city. And she describes the particular flavor of loneliness that comes from living in an urban environment. She describes the city at night. We can all picture it, and you can see it though. There is a set of lit windows in houses where individuals attend their private lives, yet are never connected. She explains that loneliness doesn't necessarily require physical solitude, but rather an absence of connection. She says it's an inability to find intimacy. I would like to actually challenge and debunk this myth of the lonely city and offer a very different perspective on urban life. And I would like to argue that it's time to celebrate city life and that to enjoy a rich urban life, we need to reconsider how our sensory experiences connect us to the world, but also others. So the reality is actually that we all live now more and more in cities. The UN came up with a study where it showed that since the 1950s, there were 750 million people living in the city, to now there's 4 billion people living in cities, which means that basically 2 out of 3 people now live in urban environments. So I think these figures really show clearly an expansion of urbanization. The concentration of urban life in cities is a reality. This creates huge challenges for the environment, but also for the social life of cities. For me, there are 2 crucial issues that emerge from that. First of all, we better get used to the fact that urban life is the way of living. And secondly, I really want to think about tonight how we can benefit from this social diversity that the city offers. So I want to start with a very simple exercise, a bit like Christina did, to get us into the mood and into the feel of things. And I want you to close briefly your eyes. Please, everybody, just briefly close your eyes and travel to the favorite city you have in the world. Or if it's London, your favorite place in London. Whether Piccadilly Circus with its bright reflections of advertising boards, the noise of its screeching buses or beeping cars, the voices of different languages surrounding you, and the irritating brush of people against you. Or maybe you're remembering a city that you recently visited. For example, sitting in a square in Barcelona, your body relaxing in the first warm rays of morning sun, children's voices playing football surrounding you while you inhale the smoke of cigarettes and hopefully also your morning coffee. You can open your eyes now. What I was really trying to do with this small exercise is that we experience cities by drawing from all our senses. It's not just a visual experience, but smell, sound, touch, and taste. All of these senses have helped you to reconstruct your experience. And it is through the combination of all the senses that we get our environmental information. To put it simple, our spatial experience and imagination is based on the interplay of body, senses, and place. The senses mediate our contact with the world. They shape our access to the surrounding environment, and they also frame the way we judge our surroundings. And it is important to point out that this sensing is very much situated. We all have individual bodies, so our bodies are situated within particular biographical timelines, but also within gendered and raced and aged bodies. But furthermore, each sense, vision, sound, taste, or touch, also situates us within a different relationship to the world. So for example, if you could picture, which is probably the right word here, if you could picture the city of vision, vision always situates the viewer outside of what they see, and it demarcates a physical distance. What you see is over there. You decide what you want to look at or what you want to ignore. The city of touch, on the other hand, is based on connection. We need to approach someone or something to feel them. The connection can be pleasant, of course, when we greet a friend, or threatening when you are jostled on a late-night tube ride. Sensing is further situated in the way that we sense. It's not just a biological or subjective process, but sensory perceptions are shaped by social values of particular cultures and historical times. So sensing is very much a social experience. vision is famously at the top of our Western hierarchy. And this derives from Aristotle's hierarchy of the senses, which considered vision and hearing as the noble so-called human senses, whereas smell, touch, and taste were considered as much more inferior and animalistic. And what is very interesting here is that moral judgments that we link with particular sensory experiences are not subjective, but reflect usually the common social discourses or hierarchies or social judgments that we have about particular places and people. So, for example, the acceptance of or rejection of particular social groups or places is always wrapped up with positive or negative sensory qualifications. And I just need, as an example, want you to think about the way, for example, migrants are often described in certain ways in certain sectors of the press. So how does this actually link back to our question about the city in the 21st century? Well, since the 1980s, Western cities have really experienced a revival of their city centers. Urban regeneration, gentrification, loft living, all these terms and buzzwords are now common discourses, not only in the press, but also at dinner tables. As the global economy has changed since the 1970s, cities across the globe are competing on what I've called in my research on our urban catwalk for international investment and tourism. And this is very much reflected, if you start looking around you, in the physical transformation of cities. Whether it includes building new squares and public spaces, like famously around King's Cross in the last few years, or think about the flagship architecture that we have now in London, from the London Eye to the Shard, etc., etc. But looking good isn't good enough anymore for cities. We live now in what's being called an experience economy, where experiences are the new currency, the selling point of products, but also increasingly of cities. So for cities to look good and be attractive on our urban catwalk, they need not to only look different, but they need to elicit a variety of different experiences and sensations. So the management of this new experiential landscape has become a key challenge for urban developers, planners, and increasingly urban politicians. The first step, for example, is to describe an area through negative sensory qualities, to devalue an area and present the physical redesign of place as the only possible option. The place is often described as dilapidated, dirty, chaotic, or stuck in time. Then the future of the area is described through positive sensory features. It's ordered, clean, vibrant, etc., etc. What is not mentioned very often is that these areas fall into disrepair because of a conscious lack of public investment. The next step is for architects and designers to design a positive and exciting urban atmosphere through through computer-generated images, as you can see in the slide above me. And this is a real example of a project where we worked in Doha with architects that redesigned the inner city of Qatar, of Doha, and where architects were consciously, as you can see in the notes, they are made by the different urban designers, etc., involved in it, in trying to get a new atmosphere happening in this place. The third step is that places are not just architecturally beautified, but a range of urban policies are consciously adopted and implemented to manipulate and manage how we feel in streets and public spaces. So, for example, think of zoning policies, such as pedestrian-only areas that are developed, or regular events that are promoted, which might include jazz music or theater, and that create particular atmospheres that appeals to the taste of some social groups, but maybe not others. And slowly, the existing population gets expelled or doesn't use a place anymore. And that's not just through rising rents, but also the transformed landscape doesn't really appeal to these, to different social groups as much as to others. So, for example, we have recently in the last 15 years seen the regeneration of spittle fields, or more recently Elephant and Castle, which has involved the transformation of buzzing working class markets with a very particular identity into middle class arts and craft markets surrounding by the same chain restaurants. We could argue that the social diversity that historically marks public spaces is increasingly diluted with these new environments. Urban development is indeed capitalizing on the sensory to turn places into products. So what I'm trying to claim here, and what my research has shown, is that the currency that local councils, politicians, and planners trade with is not just the image of our place, but the experience that they promise. The sensuously perceived ambience is as important as the physical location itself. And so while one could argue that cities are becoming increasingly homogeneous architectural environments as they follow similar design fashions and rely on identical global textures and styles, it is features such as the experience of the public life in an area or the local feel that we talk about that really sells the place and provides the sensations that differentiate the identity of places and images from city to city. And I want to show you the latest marketing campaign by Barcelona City Council that just came out last week for the World Mobile Congress, interestingly enough. It was launched there, and where they're actually selling Barcelona as a city. Short clip, what I wanted to really show you tonight is that this proves my hypothesis that cities, you don't see a single monument here of Barcelona, there's no Gaudi, nothing like that, but that cities now need to sell themselves through the public life they have, through the experiences that they provoke in their public environments and how people interact. And that we don't want anymore, to go just to a city to look at things, but we want to be there and feel and connect to the city, but also the people around us. So, however, while my research in the last 2 decades has shown that while there is a conscious aim to control and manage urban atmospheres, individuals also constantly personalize, appropriate, or adapt these environments in multiple ways. So on the one hand, we're witnessing the commercialization of urban sensations, but simultaneously, urban life always evades being captured as diverse social groups appropriate these new spaces in unexpected ways and impose their own sensory meaning and uses. And an example of that would be, there was actually in Barcelona, they regenerated this area, El Raval, and they created a museum, a Richard Meier flagship museum, with a lovely, as you can see, public space in front of it. And they tried to change the uses of that space by inviting fashion designers, etc., to have their fashion shows there. And while I was doing my research, there were several tents with TVs showing fashion, etc., fashion shows there. And I saw a Filipino family that was clearly not part of the event, sitting watching a video. And when I turned around and looked at what they were watching, they actually had exchanged the videotape. It was the 1990s. They had exchanged the videotape for a kung fu film they were actually watching. Yeah? So they were basically subverting what the designers of place, but also the event managers had wanted to do there. So there's always ways out. That's what I'm trying to show with that. So I want to go then one step further. So not only do people subvert urban environments and appropriate them, but also I want to suggest tonight that we become more aware that if we become more aware of the sensuous geography around us and engage more consciously with the sensory city, we can start to counter the anonymity and isolation that is often associated with urban life. So let me explain. Basically, cities are the places where strangers mingle. Yeah, there's no doubt around that. And they are not harmonious places, but can also be places of fear and distrust. So to be among strangers, we resort to a range of social practices to negotiate our daily encounters with other people. And we learn to act as though we all were equal. According to the famous urban critic Richard Sennett, the city is where we learn to be civil. We learn to tolerate difference in the city. And as Sennett further explains, in urban public places, the diversity and complexity of different people and cultures becomes an available social experience. So while Sennett advocates this kind of open city, he says very little how this should happen in practice. And here I don't want to offer a superficial celebration of urban diversity, and it's really important to point out that racism, sexism, or ageism, amongst others, frame power relations in public spaces. But in my view, a focus on the sensory engagements of that urban life in all its density and diversity offers provides at least a possibility to remake the city and our social relations, as it forces us to literally crash into each other again and again and again. And this is not to romanticize urban encounters. Coming into close contact with different people can also be a very threatening experience. Think of sexual harassment or racially motivated attacks. But as research recently also by Les Back with young people in London shows, where he actually interviewed and observed young people in London from very diverse backgrounds, he shows that cultural contact, a curiosity in our surrounding landscape, and I would add a focus on the senses and our sensory interactions, allows for a much more humane and engaged city. So whether it is finding joy in the surrounding architecture or walking this morning in the crispy snow towards the bus stop, or whether it's in the everyday encounters that make us feel engaged and familiar in places, from a tube driver that makes a carriage laugh through his or her announcements, to the greetings we might get from a regular news agent or coffee shop, it is all these experiences and all those sensory interactions that kind of help to develop a kinesthetic empathy that makes cities more tolerant places, but also less lonely. Indeed, we're coming now to the second exercise of tonight, or the third, with Christina's included. So I want you to really briefly take the effort and look into the eyes of the person next to you. And then I want you to shake hands. Properly shake hands. Yes, I want you to touch each other. So of course, you know, this small gesture changes the relation you had with a stranger next to you. It's awkward, yes, I agree, but it also creates some sort of connection. And it is really with this last thought that I want to finish the evening. I think it has become clear that despite the important challenges that intense urbanization brings and that urban life is full of, cities with their dense, diverse and heterogeneous lives are also crucial places that offer the opportunity to learn about oneself and tolerate difference. And I strongly believe that it is in the city and through our sensory encounters that we learn to connect to the world, but also to others. And that's what I want to finish with. And if you want to find out more, go to some of the websites where my research is featured. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Monica. That was fascinating. And in fact, the Sensory Cities project is absolutely superb. So I recommend people to have a look at that. I learned a lot from looking at that work. So our final speaker tonight is Dr. Gabriela Spinelli, who is a reader in design innovation in the Department of Design here at Brunel. Her interests are situated at the crossroads of the design of artefacts with self-perception and health. Her research approach is people-centred and multidisciplinary, designed to enhance integrity and inclusion. And her work on design for inclusion has been particularly important for the institution over the last few years. Dr. Spinelli will argue that design enables connections with ourselves and with others, and that is where happiness truly lies.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for being here despite the weather, because it means you care about happiness, and that is what we're discussing tonight. Tonight, I will argue that design doesn't have the job to make things look good. Indeed, it is to do good things by enabling us to be ourselves and to connect to one another. The story I want to tell you started a long time ago. In the 14th century Surrey. Once upon a time there was a Franciscan friar called William of Ockham. He came up with a principle that today we know as the Occam razor. It stated, non est ponenda plurima sine necessitate, which translates in English, entities must not be multiplied unnecessarily. This stands for an effort to shave off complexity from the theories that we were building around natural phenomena. But Occam razor was also a response to the darkness, the irrationality, and the scientific fog of the medieval time. For a long time, the idea that simplicity was a virtue worth pursuing inspired scientists, intellectuals, inventors, such as Leonardo, Newton, Galileo. But intellectuals also warned us that bringing simplicity to the extreme might create models of reality that are inadequate. Now, please jump with me and do a big leap in time and land in 1960s, when computer scientists are building computers. And they are saying that the computer is the analogy for the mind. The brain is the hardware, the mind is the software, and the body doesn't feature, is not needed, is discarded. But we know that through the body we perceive, we feel, we compute, we respond to the environment. In the 1980s, scientists came up with a new idea of computers. It was inspired to the biology of the brain and included two components. Nodes, similar to our neurons, and connections, similar to our synapses. They called them neural networks. It became apparent straight away that cognition wasn't happening in one place, it was distributed. It was happening across the whole network. So if I explain it better, if you could take a Polaroid of the brain thinking of an apple, you couldn't see the picture of the apple held in any place, a singular place of the network, but every place will hold an attributes of the apple. In other words, it's only the system in its entirety that can think about the apple. Another game changer took place in the 90s. Ed Hutchins, a professor of cognitive science from California University, came up with what we know, a theory called distributed cognition. He claimed that cognition doesn't stop to the skull of an individual, but extend to a network of resources. And this network of resources include people, artifacts, and spaces. We do so because we are short of some skills, such as memory. And we need artifacts to remind us of what we want to do. This was particularly important because we're now moving away from the idea that we're just thinking with the brain. Our networks is bigger. An interesting example that he brought in his book, published in 1995, and I recommend strongly, called Cognition in the Wild, is of a captain of a ship. He's trying to maneuver safely the ship back into harbor, but he cannot rely on his direct sightings, so he has to read the onboard instruments, communicate with staff on the land, and talks to his member of staff that have some sightings of what's happening in the maneuvering. The essence is that the safe maneuvering of the ship is not performed by an individual, but by the system. We know very little about Ed Hutchins, but we know that he likes surfing and his dog likes it too. In everyday life, we see distributed cognition happening everywhere, in simple tasks. When we go shopping, we write our shopping list because sometimes we forget what we need to buy. And by doing so, we change the nature of our task. We need to read, which we are able to do in any case. We don't have to remember things. This is the grocery list of Michelangelo Buonarroti. He initially wrote down his list, as we all would do, but then his servant couldn't read, so he had to draw it. The transformations there are two, one from memory to committing to a piece of paper, and the second from writing to drawing, so that the system, Michelangelo and servant, could perform two tasks, the shopping and the painting. It's also true that we use the environment for thousands of years because we use the stars to orient and navigate the space. But because the sky is not always clear, we then invented instruments that allow us to navigate. So, allow me to summarize the ground we covered so far. The brain needs the body to be able to think. The skull and the skin are not the boundaries of our cognition. The individual is no longer the unit of analysis, but the system is. And the system includes artifact systems and other people. We organize ourselves in social groups because we need to perform complex tasks. And finally, we design our environment and the objects around us in order to support our life. The way we design a new space in order to support our performance has been the subject of many studies. This is Einstein's office. Not quite tidy. Findings reveal that tidy spaces induce orderly behavior, and that untidy spaces stimulate mold-breaking actions. It is also true that creativity seems to be the result of searches through random documents that have been untidily stuck. And this creativity is not possible in spaces where tidy people have filed everything perfectly. Bringing this closer to home, imagine buying a book in a store or online. You're probably going to come out of the store with more than you planned to purchase because something was interesting next to what you were looking for. And if you instead bought online, probably your checkout is cheaper. Human and the environment are interconnected, and they evolve together. On one end, we capture the way we feel, we think, we function in the artifacts and in the space around us. And on the other end, the space and the artifacts around us remind us and tell us who we are by telling us how to think, to function, and to feel. This mutually defining relationship has been studied for centuries. And indeed, Michael Tomasello, an evolutionary anthropologist, told us that the reason why we stood up is because our social group was getting bigger in size. When we stood up, then the change of our neck and throat changed, and that allowed space for the larynx to expand. And that expansion allowed for better sounds, and that's how the language started. Fundamentally, the human race defines itself through what it creates. And what we create, our culture, keep defining ourselves. But if the relationship with the environment is so fundamentally strong and so quintessentially us, it defines us, well, what do this type of space say about what we are and what we are trying to be? These are hostile architectural interventions to keep poverty away, hidden, so that a homeless person couldn't sleep on their ground or couldn't sit on their flower bed. This is designed for exclusion, to keep us disconnected. And how about this chair? It's called the B chair. Would you be proud to have your child with achondroplasia, commonly known as dwarfism, sitting at that chair while you invite family and friends for dinner? That chair cost £1,500. I claim at the beginning of the presentations that design, when it's good, enables us. First of all, though, to do so, design needs to understand what the problem is. We did a study to understand why older adults were adopting new technology less than the average population. We found out that technology are expensive. They are precious. And when they are used, they should be used with care and wrapped up in cellophane. So they last longer. We also found out that technology are complicated, redundant, and there is a picture of a remote control where I ask the participant to blank all the buttons that were not used. We also found out that technology make us vulnerable because they ask so much of us. They ask too many login and password, and this participant decided to print it out and hang it in the front room, making her very vulnerable. And in the second example, you find someone that doesn't rely on technology anymore, having had a stroke and not being able to use his phone to call his wife, who was just in the kitchen. He decided to have a dinner bell nearby, so at least he could make some sort of noise if he hopped on the good leg to get to the bell. In 2013, the Pew Research Center in the US found out that only 18% of 65 plus adopted a smartphone, compared to 56% of the average of the rest of the population. When smartphones came out on the market, they were a miracle of innovation. They brought together artifacts, functionality, applications that we couldn't imagine being in such a small package. They were targeted for people that knew what to do with a navigational system. They knew what to do with a digital radio, with a digital camera, with a Skype on your phone. But older people thought of a phone as a device you use to make phone calls, at best to send and receive a text message. So they didn't have the entrenched knowledge, the schema needed to understand this new device. Or in other words, they didn't have the hook on which to hang a mobile phone. When design enables us, it supports us to do things that we are no longer able to do, or that we have never been able to do. Design can also bring technological advancement. It can make us dream of futuristic scenario. But it is also multi-purpose, and while it resolves a problem, it also adds aesthetic value. In these pictures, you see many pictures of ears, and they all contain a piece of jewelry that also is an hearing aid. The wheelchair that you see in there is for indoor and outdoor use, and the blades, they're not particularly beautiful to look at, but they give us an Olympic performance. But designed to do so, and to enable us, has to do so with dignity. It shouldn't just make us survive. It should give us a rich and full life. Those pictures don't give us that. Those are raised toilets that have been designed in the 50s and they are still the same. Those are control devices that you see on the front of that man that they call puff and suck. And they are there to switch through the command of the computers. Not really sociable devices, I would say. Through design, we also make difference to our community. With design thinking, we can create a circular economy through which we identify the value that we play for each other, the connections that we can create with each other. And these are few examples of global time banks, including a homegrown one, the one at the bottom, that is hosted at Brunel. It is through circular economy that we recognize the non-monetary function and value that our skill as a social capital can bring to the community, making each community resilient. So let me leave you with one thought. If our abilities to think are extended and distributed, if we are each other components, if we are necessary and instrumental to each other way of thinking and feeling and being, surely there must be truly a way to design a collective happiness. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Gabriella. That concluded 3 absolutely brilliant talks. Also, I'm pleased to see plugging our brilliant research projects and indeed setting the audience a little bit of homework as well, I think, in most cases. Lots to read on if you want to follow some of those links. So now the lectures are open for questions. I could just remind you again to try to be brief so we can get as many questions and answers in as possible, and to say your name before you ask your question, right? Somewhere we have people with microphones. Could you raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, please? We've got this gentleman down at the front is the first person I've seen.
Hello. Thank you very much for 3 very good presentations. I might be mistaken, but I think the first 2 presentations focused on loneliness. Is loneliness seen as the opposite of happiness?
I think, Christina, you need to start off because you started that, so I think you need to...
Yeah, no, probably not. I've spent most of my academic career trying to decide what the opposite of loneliness is, but it may be happiness, could be well-being, but loneliness can contribute to happiness, or the other way around.
I think we also didn't really, we initially didn't want to call it happiness.
No.
We were both, all 3 not happy with the
But we
title.
were forced.
But we were forced, because it sells.
And you're here, so it worked.
So I think the opposite, there isn't, Christina mentioned, that loneliness are different forms of experience, and there's solitude as well, you know, and I think we move in and out of these kind of emotions, and it's important to embrace them as part of what it's like to be human. Like, I think we also cherish being on our own quite often. So it's really finding more of a balance, I think, and I think what we tried both to do is to demystify, you know, the negative attitudes towards loneliness. Yeah, and in my case particularly, I think the city is a place where you can have a lot of solitude, and of course you can feel sometimes lonely, but there's also the potential of urban life to make you reach out. And I don't mean only with people, but, you know, find happiness or contentment in your own company when you enjoy your environment, for example.
I think if I may add, I think happiness is the meta subject of the three talks, and I think it's important to link them within that framework. I think loneliness and happiness are both transient experience, and as such we have to experience them as such, and we were taking different approaches or different takes on emotions that contribute to exactly that, happiness.
Christina, you were going to...
No, I
No,
just
okay,
to
right.
stop the
Thank you.
light
Thank you
getting
very
on my
much.
glasses.
Ben.
actually.
Thank you, fantastic talks. Gabriella, if I may ask you, your final statement, surely we can design collective happiness. Suggestions? How would we do that?
It will be very easy for me to say, go up and sign up to be a partner as a give and taker. You would expect that from me. I think that we have explored through the public lecture as well that we are a system. We all have to contribute. We are not disconnected, and everyone has to do their own. We start with the plastic, we look at trust, we look at artificial intelligence and data, and now our happiness. We all have to contribute our bit. We all have to be decent individuals if we want to have a decent system in which we want to live on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question would be to you, Monica. I won't call it loneliness, I would call it lack of interaction. Because if you get interaction, then happiness can come from that, or loneliness. But do you think that we, in our quest to overcome our lack of housing, we build our houses, we start single bedrooms, two bedrooms, we're building in isolation, and we've got our Ethel on the 37th floor, she's not going to get the interaction. And also young people are living more on their own now, and again, we are building in isolation. We don't have gardens where you could have a communal talk. You don't see people walking past. So once we go home, roll out today, we shut our door, and there is our isolation. Or we create the problems for the future.
Right. I mean, first of all, I come from a Mediterranean culture, so we all live in flats, and, you know, just think of Italy or Spain, like, you don't need a garden to interact. So I would say, you know, that it's a bit of a myth that people don't interact in high-rise. There's very strong community often in high-rise, as also the Grenfell Tower disaster showed in a, you know, really negative way, but also positive in terms of how much community there was. So I would be a bit, I would question that assumption. And I think houses are built for one or two people only as, you know, 1-2 bedroom flats because of economic reasons mainly. And I guess that's something that we need to also think about as a nation, but also as a world. You know, what kind of housing do we need? And I think it's a big question at the moment in Britain, how this gets taken further. So I don't know if I've exactly answered your question, but I think it's about thresholds. I mean, that would be my exact answer to you. We need to create thresholds for people to be able to interact and to, you know, connect. And I don't think we need deep interactions all the time. I'm not saying that we should all be hugging each other constantly or anything like that. But I think it's often, and it links also to Gabriela's lecture, also, the connections we have maybe to things or places that make us feel, more in tune with ourselves and with our environment.
Does anybody else want to think of? Christina?
Yeah, I guess certainly, I think following on from Monica, we don't think perhaps sufficiently rigorously and don't spend enough time thinking about public spaces and designing them so that we can have interaction. I think, was it you had the public spaces where people couldn't sit by the flower beds?
Oh, no, that was Gabriella.
My apologies. And when we're designing those, we're thinking about excluding people. We're not designing for social inclusion. So I think our obsession with keeping particular groups of people out of the city is also affecting the rest of the population. I'm a great believer in public benches and places where people, minimal investment, places where people can sit and rest and watch the world go by and chat and interact with their environment. And I think they are not prioritised particularly.
I would like to see how many of us would be able to lift the fences of the garden are adjacent to each other, just for a week. Just to see how many terraces will turn their garden into a public space where everyone can meet each other. I would like to see if people would take that as an experiment.
And sorry, the last point, and back to Gabriela's point about designing for more collective happiness in terms of building houses and flats. I think one of the problems of many of the new developments is that you can't really open windows properly. There are these, you can't, why in Mediterranean culture there is a sense of community is that inside the building everybody hangs the washing out. So you have to, again, crash into each other and wish each other good morning and then talk to the neighbor downstairs. And I think that's a bit of, not failure, but a lack of thinking at the moment in design, that we need to, like Gabriela said, think about collective, like a collective well-being and how these thresholds might bring people together.
I think it's true. I come from a similar culture, and I think we lost the serendipity of losing a pair of trousers, going down the windows and having to go downstairs and knock at the people downstairs and say, oh, hi, by the way, I live on the first floor and I'm sorry, can I have my trousers? But that sort of casual interactions don't exist anymore because we build perfect units and those units don't make sense on their own.
That's very interesting. Sarita.
Thank you. Thank you very much for three superb talks. I enjoyed them very much. So, I suppose building on from what you just said, I wonder how we address social inequalities that exist, and whether it's class inequalities, gender, race inequalities that we know, for example, exist in cities. When you think about Queens in New York, we think about Stonehenge Estate and Grenfell Tower in London. How do we fit that into our analysis, and how do we potentially build, you touched on it, a more inclusive design, a more inclusive space, whether it's in sort of city space or otherwise?
I'll start. Although the subject of today's section, the lecture is happiness. So I'll keep it, bringing back to that. So I will have a partial view, which is that of a designer or at least a researcher in design. I would say that it doesn't matter what's the economic value of what your output is going to be, you can always have a user-centered approach. You have to understand what the problem is first. You have to understand what the tensions are, the attritions point. You can do that, you can apply the same methodology in policy making to understand where there is inequality and to what extent it can be tolerated. And to then design interventions that can be social spaces, distribution of wealth, taxation, that actually make us all have a different, but all respect our differences, but all have dignity in participation.
I would also add to what Gabriela says, and I mean, yeah, it's difficult because on the one hand, I think cities will always be unequal spaces, and partly that's, but you know, I'm aware I'm saying that from a very privileged background. That's partly the beauty of it, that we have to encounter difference and inequality, and I think that it, like I say in my talk, that we develop more empathy by having to see things we might not want to look at or smell things, etc., etc. But I think that policy now has taken on some of these ideas in terms of placemaking, and that's the trendy word in urban policy making. We need to think about placemaking and how to incorporate different social groups and classes. But like I said, they think about it very much in terms of entertaining the public. I think public spaces, ideally are also places where, where people rub against each other in positive and in negative ways. And I think, A, it creates more awareness, and that's important. And two, I think that also what policymakers need to become more aware of and think about it, that wealth needs to be distributed so we don't live in extreme cities such as, that I'm making, like, for example, Brazil or in South Africa, where people just live in gated communities and don't engage at all. So I think, from a very European and enlightened perspective, I think it's to our benefit that we make cities much more equal spaces. And I think that starts with equal opportunities, that we all get, the same opportunities in terms of housing, but also schooling, etc. But that's a long road to walk, I think. Yeah.
Right, that gentleman there further back, and then we'll take this gentleman here.
Does the panel think then that the mayor's concept of healthy streets will increase happiness, reduce loneliness?
Sorry, could you just repeat that? I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
Does the panel think, therefore, that the mayor's concept of healthy streets will increase happiness, reduce loneliness?
Healthy streets.
Oh, healthy streets.
Yeah, healthy.
So the Mayor of London?
I think there is no.
I don't think we've got a strong opinion on this.
Yeah,
anyway. That was what I detected.
Or we might, but we might not want to voice them. That's not the first initiative that comes with. It's just a new label. We had happy neighbors. I think in the past we had cooking for each other, exchanging meals, exchanging lift. We are kind of reinventing the wheel here. We're saying we need to be human and to communicate and to socialize. We call it healthy streets, let's call it healthy streets. We call it circular economy, let's call it a circular economy. What we need is to be human and fulfill all the needs that we have as humans and to look after each other, because without each other we don't really make sense.
I think there's also a need, and I don't know if Sadiq Khan has incorporated that, for organic things to happen. Yeah. So it's not just about designing, for purpose, but also leaving space for, the unexpected to happen.
But that is design too.
Yeah, but that's where we sometimes don't agree with. I think we should leave design out sometimes. Completely, and think about it. And some of the best streets in London are the less regulated ones. There's been an amazing project. Of course, I can't remember the name of the street, but in South London, where all the there's about 300 people from 300 different countries, or not 300, but 30 along a street, 30 different countries have their shops, and it's not very much regulated. And within the shops, they have, again, mini shops, like they have often in African cities, etc., where they, it's been sublet, etc., and it's one of the most vibrant streets in London. in terms of, healthy quality of public life, etc. And I think that has happened because that particular borough, didn't clamp down, didn't say we need to do this, and it just, organically evolved. So, I don't know. Yeah.
Right, we'll take that question, that gentleman there. Hello.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yep.
it is. There was quite a focus on externality design, how that makes people happy. No one really mentioned about, say, Prozac or the happy pills that people are given.
Yeah.
What's the general consensus on the danger of trying to make people happy with food, alcohol, drugs, etc.? Just wondering.
Christina, you must have studied that in your long career.
Yes. Yeah. Personally tried all of these things. Yeah. I mean, one of the key issues and the problems I have with the current loneliness debate is that we're trying to medicalise it. We're looking for an intervention, a drug that can cure you for loneliness. I think variations in happiness, variations in loneliness, variations in perceptions of well-being are part and parcel of being human, and we don't want to be happy all the time. What would be the point? Unless it's listening to me talk, in which case it's a state to which we can all aspire.
But there's also been a huge boom in self-help literature. It's, the happiness search seems to be never ending at the moment. I mean, I'm very critical of it, and that's why, we didn't like the title of Happiness.
I wish I could remember who picked the title.
Yes.
Again, in terms of urban living, I find it interesting that, again, it is this performance of, happy encounters. Oh yeah, let's all, socialize in a good way. And urban life isn't like that, as we know. And one thing is also being somewhere in the daytime. And another thing is being there at nighttime. And depending who you are, you feel more vulnerable or less vulnerable. So I'm quite critical of this facade of vibrant, happy cultures all around us. Yeah.
Yeah, that works. So you mentioned how we see the apple within our brain. And I'm not going to direct this question about happiness or loneliness. And I see loneliness as being not connectedness. So when we now design for happiness or loneliness, it seems to be that our brain sees things in quite an abstract way. It sees maybe different senses, it sees an apple through different experiences in life. But the way we have things designed now, like you could put Tinder, for example, people swap left and right based on very basic senses. And perhaps a lot of our interactions, all the stuff online, and we don't talk to cashier anymore. We have very disconnected lives. So it's perhaps should there be a design that is based on not just providing us the basic needs like you mentioned, but in technology maybe more in any other way, give us more interaction with all of our senses that we actually are.
Designed for using all your senses.
Technology are developing in that way to be more sensorial and to allow a more holistic interactions with all parts of the body and generate data that is richer. But what I was explaining there with the Polaroid and the Apple is the difference between symbolic manipulations and connectivism. But also give an example of the fact that no one holds a truth that we all together make a system. So I think technology per se, the right and the left can be very useful at times. John, the guy that had a stroke, and would have benefited a lot from a phone where for some reason he was able to recognize stress in his sweat and able to make a phone call and sweat right or left to make a phone call. There was an emergency. Technology per se are neutral. It's up to us what we want to do with them.
Right, we'll take one question there and then Akram, and I think that'll probably be all we can manage.
Hello, yeah, thanks very much for the talks this evening. I'm just interested, Gabriella, you talked a lot about elderly people now not being perhaps tech savvy. So should my generation be comforted by the fact that we will be, and these problems may not be so common in the future?
So the cohort effect might not be as strong, but when we become old, there will be driverless car out there. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel quite shaky at the knees. So technology will always be a step ahead. So there will always be a digital divide, so to speak. Probably will not be as big as it has been, but there might still be some. Yeah. Very good.
Me neither.
Great.
Yep.
Monica, you mentioned during your talk that urban living is the way of living. Is there not, can such a urban centricism not become insular and problematic? Maybe cities need to be designed in such a way that we have a greater connection with the rural around us and not look so inward. And maybe that's where such a disparity in our country comes from, the fact that London is so inward looking and so hell-bent on trying to create these experiences for Londoners, whereas it should be the capital of the whole country. It should be there to serve for everyone's conduciveness.
Yeah, I practiced this talk this morning with a friend of mine, and she pointed that out to me. So yes, no, I agree. I don't know if there's a danger of cities being too insular because of two issues. First of all, the London-ish problem is particular to the UK. You know, and it's due to historical reasons that the UK operates like that. And I'm very much against how it is working at the moment, but there doesn't seem to be a real move from the government, whether it's Labour or Tory, to change that, which I really don't understand. If you look at Germany, Spain, etc., you have, you know, less centralistic kind of models. So, you know, one way forward would be to decentralize the UK, but that's a huge political issue, so I'll leave it there. Yeah. And I would, you know, I lived in Manchester and Birmingham. I would really advocate that. On the other hand, I also think that cities are taking on a lot of rural practices, even in architecture with green gardening, etc. But again, I'm thinking in Barcelona, there's now a lot of allotments, and there's a lot of green urban nature within culture, within cities. And Britain has been pretty good with its allotment culture to sustain that, although again it's under threat, you know, because of the constant, you know, development, etc. So I agree, yes, we need to, you know, the rural and the urban need to mix much more, but it is a reality that more and more people are migrating to cities because they offer opportunities, etc., etc. So I guess I wanted to start with something factual like that. And yeah, I don't know. I think rather than seeing cities only, you know, I didn't want to be seen as a complete, you know, the part of the metropolitan elite. But what I was trying to say that urban environments facilitate, you know, learning from each other, etc., much more than possibly rural environments. But it's not an absolute statement. Yeah.
Right. I'm just going to take two very quick questions and then we'll need to finish. So this lady here and then Akram.
Just wondered, as we're at Brunel, and over the last 10 years, the spaces here have changed enormously, and lots of external spaces and internal spaces have been created. I'd be interested in your comments.
Well,
they reflect about this community.
Well, the central quad in front of the lecture centre was deliberately grassed over in order to make it a more usable space for the students in the summer, and that has certainly worked.
Yeah,
That's a theoretical physicist's observation.
The design has moved into a new building not long ago and has provided a lot of casual spaces for students to meet and and reflect the nature of the people that they are, not just the tasks they perform. Obviously, when you have open spaces, it could create a bit of frictions with the fact that you might want to have confidential information, but for that we have other spaces. So I'm just talking about the specific design because it's the closest to me, because we moved not long ago. I think it's been an advantage when I speak to students. They really like the open space, the fact that we have internal balcony on every floor, and the downside of that, if you really want to look at the downside, is that we have to share offices. But share offices have got goods and bad points. There is no perfection out there.
We're
So I'm going to stay.
Definitely not going to start that discussion.
Yeah, I'm going to stay. I'm going to be careful here, right?
Akram.
So thank you very much for that. I mean, I have a slight worry about this hierarchical structure that a society, and in fact, you've also sort of amplified and added value to, that there is this happiness and then there is loneliness.
Yeah.
And I think to some extent it sort of brings to mind what Beckett wrote in When You Forgot Her. She gave birth astride the grave. We see life but for a fleeting second, and we're back into it again. And I think that fleeting second that we see life is actually rediscovering something about our humanity, what it means to be separated, what it means to be alone. And maybe it's a human instinct, a human state of being. And maybe the title should have been the other way around. How can we design to be lonely? And to be in that state? I mean, solitude, isolation, and alone are in fact beautiful places to be in, and are as equivalent in trying to understand and minimizing the loneliness that one feels. And that's a journey. There's always a representation, a clouding to some extent, of hiding that. Architecture, spaces, art, literature, etc. They all represent that to some extent. So maybe it's the other way around we need to look at. Thanks.
I'm just going to agree with him, right?
Yeah. I thought that was an abstract.
All right.
But I think you're right. A lot of the debate about loneliness doesn't acknowledge that it's part of all of our experiences and wants to not see it as part of being human, but actually to pathologize as something bad that we should avoid. I'm sure for people perhaps for whom it's a chronic and enduring problem, that may be a different issue. But for most of us, it's one of the things that enables us to understand we're human. If we're lonely, then we appreciate company when we have it. We can appreciate so many things through it. It's not something to be afraid of.
I would be quite concerned if I had a conversation with someone who told me they were happy 100% of the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that can be pathological as well. So it's the fluctuation between these transits, emotions that make us who we are, and I think that's what we should respect. But it's difficult to capture all that into a title.
But lastly, the last thing I would like to say is that it's also about having a choice. Like if I choose to be on my own and lonely, then fair enough, but we need to think that, maybe sometimes we don't choose. It's a very artistic way, seeing the architect, on his own in front of the building. I mean, we romanticize sometimes loneliness as well, I think. So it's finding, we all say the balance. And, if you choose to be on your own, fair enough. But we also should have the opportunity to engage and look for contact.
And have a choice.
Yeah. And it's to go back, I think, to Sarita's point. In loneliness, in well-being, in happiness, there are groups who are excluded who don't have that choice. And maybe that's another issue we need to address in a different forum. Those who are excluded and we exclude them and don't enable them to engage. I think that's a very different experience.
Right, I think that's a lovely moment to finish. So I think we should thank our three speakers for 3 lovely lectures and a really interesting discussion. So it's nearly time to just step outside and continue the discussion over a glass of wine. And I just want to reintroduce Bill Leahy and to thank him on behalf of the speakers and the audience over the last 4 nights for his hard work in putting this public lecture series on.
So thank you very much for that, Geoff. I think I chose the word happiness. Sorry. So just a couple of things before we go. I'm sure you want to go out there and mingle and not feel so lonely sitting there in your seats. There's a free glass of wine or beer out there if you want to stay and discuss with us, discuss with the speakers who are sticking around. So please do. Next Thursday, I think it is an inaugural lecture from our Professor Matthew Seligman. Wednesday. Oh, God, sorry, I kept saying Thursday. Next Wednesday, I can't read it from here. So next Wednesday, our inaugural lecture, that should be very interesting as well. We have these booklets outside, okay? Now, they also tell about future events, and there's one in there that I wanted to flag up because it's the final one on that we're advertising, and it's a Shakespeare week, okay? But why I wanted to flag it up is because the date is wrong. That's to say, it's the date when it's starting because it's starting on Shakespeare's birthday, Shakespeare week, and of course we all know Shakespeare's birthday is... Oh, okay. It's the 23rd of April. Okay, see me afterwards, all of you. You should have known that. Okay, 23rd of April, we've got Shakespeare Week. We've got 4 events happening on 4 evenings in that week. And we've got a debate. Did he write the plays or didn't he write the plays? We've got a lecture by Alexander Waugh, the grandson of Evelyn Waugh. And on the Wednesday, the highlight is Sir Mark Rylance is coming back to do a wonderful performance for us. Actually, no, the highlight is the Thursday when I'm doing something. That's the highlight, I forgot, yeah. Okay, so if you do pick up that booklet, just remember it's the 23rd, not the 3rd. If you sign up for the What's On Guide, you'll get that information anyway. Before we go, I just want to thank a few people, if you will. First of all, the AV people up there who have made it look so wonderful for all 4 weeks. Thank you so much. They have made it look great, but they're a bit of a pain, to be honest. Also, thank you to the events team. Karina's sitting up there. Karina and her team, who also make it look wonderful. Thank you. I want to thank the steering group for the public lectures series. There's Teresa Waller up there. Thank you, Teresa. There's Brunel's Mr. Lonely, Akram Khan down here. Geoff, of course. And most especially, will you please put your hands together for Tom Ryan and Seb Jenner. Now, please do stick around because Tom and Seb will particularly help you out with drinking the wine. They're very, very hospitable in that. Last thing to say is please join me in thanking our 3 fantastic speakers for the evening. And finally, thank all of you for coming. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.